Good afternoon and welcome to this ARC-Talks webinar. Today we're having an update from Kristen Sue, our Executive Director of Research at ARC, on the ATTR amyloidosis clinical trial updates. So we'll be hearing about the latest and greatest in research that's currently going on. Kristen, can I have you move forwards with the slides? So just by way of introduction, I'm Isabel Lisada. I'm the CEO and founder of ARC, the Amyloidosis Research Consortium. It was founded in 2015, so this year we're going to be 10 years old. And we're dedicated to accelerating the pace of research, speeding discovery, and improving quality of life for patients. And our vision is to really make a significant impact on the curability of amyloidosis. We have 4 areas that we work in, or 4 areas of focus, I should say. And those are improving the speed and accuracy of diagnosis. And many of you here will have experienced the impact of delays in diagnosis. So that's a critical piece to improving quality of life. The 2 middle goals are really around improving the science. And the first one is around increasing the understanding about the disease, the genetics, the biology of the disease, to be able to identify new treatments. And then how we move to accelerate research to get treatments developed more quickly. And lastly, an area that's vitally important is improving care and quality of life for patients and caregivers throughout their journey with amyloidosis. ARC-Talks fits nicely into that last bucket. So I'm now going to hand over, and just first of all, before I hand over, I'd like to thank our sponsors who've supported our ARC-Talks webinar series. And just of note, before I hand over to Kristen, if you have any questions, feel free to write them. There's a little box with an arrow on it, a Q&A box that you'll find in the bottom bar of your screen. And write your questions in, and we'll have time to answer questions at the end of Kristen's presentation. So thank you, Kristen. I'm delighted to hand over to you, and we look forward to hearing about update on trials.
So thanks, Isabel. So for those of you who have not joined one of these talks before, my name is Kristen Sue. I'm the Executive Director of Research here at the Amyloidosis Research Consortium. I've been with ARC for over 8 years now, which is hard to believe. My background, though, prior to joining ARC is actually in designing and executing clinical trials. So I had worked for a number of small to mid-sized biotech companies working in phase 1 through phase 3 studies for large diseases like Alzheimer's disease and small, rare, ultra-rare diseases with a handful few of patients in each. And so designing, working on trials is something I really enjoy. And so I'm excited to kind of take that knowledge that I built in the biotech space and share it with patients and hopefully help inform you a bit about what your options are if you are interested in enrolling in clinical trials. So today I'm going to focus on trials that are taking place in the TTR amyloidosis space. I will go over what causes TTR and the treatment mechanisms that are being studied to a degree, but most of the discussion is really going to focus on the clinical trials. And so if you're newly diagnosed and just starting to learn about the disease, this might be a lot to take in, starting with some of the resources on ARC's website, our disease booklets, some of the other webinars where we kind of go more into what causes TTR amyloidosis, how to manage it, might be good first steps to take. But I'm going to do my best to cover as much as I can here and in a way that hopefully everybody will be able to follow and take forward and figure out what the next steps are for yourselves. Please feel free to take screenshots, share anything that you like from this presentation with your doctors, ask more questions, discuss different studies in more detail. We will make this presentation available on our website, the recording, so that you'll be able to take this and use it. It will be available. And again, today we're going to cover TTR only. We're planning to do our next clinical trials webinar that will discuss AL amyloidosis in April. And so this will be something that every 3 months we'll have a webinar that focuses on either AL or TTR amyloidosis. And so before we dive directly into the trials, I'm going to start by just quickly kind of covering some of the fundamentals of clinical research. What are some of the key pieces of information that patients, potential study participants should take when they're considering whether or not to participate in clinical trials? So clinical trials or clinical studies are a type of research that evaluate whether a medical strategy, drug, treatment, or device is safe and effective for patients. They can also look at other aspects of care, like improving quality of life. They can be used to just observe patients over time to generate data that helps us understand how a disease progresses, what different markers can be studied to determine whether a treatment might work. There are a lot of different types of studies that can be done. Generally, the two main types of trials are either bucketed as interventional trials, which involve the administration of some type of intervention, a treatment, a drug, a device, which is given, and researchers study how that impacts patients, or observational trials, where patients are observed over a period of time and their outcomes are measured. Now, clinical studies are classified into different stages that are called phases. Phase 1 studies typically involve the smallest number of patients. They're used to study the safety of a treatment, of an intervention, and select the right dose to study in larger number of patients. And they're also used to understand how drugs might behave in somebody's body and how it affects different markers within the body. Phase 2 studies generally are then larger in numbers. They typically involve a limited number of doses, potentially one dose, maybe one or two different doses. And it's the first time you're usually studying whether a drug has an intended outcome in patients. So understanding whether the drug is efficacious, studying efficacy. Phase 3 are your largest studies before approval, before a drug gets approved. This is where you are generating data to confirm how well a treatment works to have a desired effect. It's typically comparing that treatment to a placebo or a standard of care. That's the last phase of clinical research, typically before a drug gets approved, and moves into what's known as phase 4, which is post-regulatory approval, usually done to gather more information after a drug has been marketed, understand, broader safety signals, long-term side effects, long-term use of a drug. Now, it's really important to note that there is absolutely no single or linear roadmap to developing a new drug. Some drugs will skip phases, some will combine phases, some might need to have multiple studies within a single phase before it moves on to the next one. And so it's not a simple phase 1, 2, 3 approval for most drugs. This is especially true when it comes to rare disease, and there are so few patients. And so where I started working in Alzheimer's disease, and you typically see thousands of patients in a phase 3 drug, in a phase 3 study, that's less common as you're looking in rare disease. And there are some rare diseases where phase 3 studies might only involve handfuls of patients. And so I just point that out to say it's very different for every single disease, particularly in rare disease. So what's involved in clinical trials? So most are interventional and require administration of some sort of study drug or treatment, and then a series of visits to specialized and trained study centers for tests to monitor how that drug is working in patients. Some studies do allow for these tests and visits to be done at home health visits, but most are going to be done at a study site. Depending on the size of the study, there might only be 1 or 2 sites across the US where patients can actually participate, or there could be many, there could be dozens. It's really important to think about, if you're interested in enrolling in a trial, understanding where those study sites are and how easy or difficult it might be for you to travel to a site repeatedly over the course of a study. Many study sponsors are able to support travel costs for patients, but not all. And so it's something that it's really important to ask about specifically. Most study visits can usually be conducted in a single day, but there might be some studies that require overnight visits. And so that's another thing to ask about and make sure you're aware of upfront. Now, trials for TTR amyloidosis typically require some common visit procedures that most studies will require that you do. So it might be a clinical examination, so physical exam, checking your vital signs, making sure that your medications and any side effects you might be experiencing are all noted. Blood and urine collections. You might be asked to complete questionnaires, which are usually called patient-reported outcome measures, that they might ask you about your symptoms, how the symptoms are impacting different aspects of your life. There might be functional tests that you have to do. A common one is the 6-minute walk test or the 6-minute hall walk. Many of you have probably done, where traffic cones are set up 30 meters apart and you're asked to walk around those traffic cones for 6 minutes. And a study team is measuring then how the distance that you're able to walk in that time. And so it's actually a validated measure of how well your heart is functioning. And it's something that's commonly used in research studies. Another test that's becoming more commonly used in TTR amyloidosis is cardiopulmonary exercise testing. So a treadmill test where you might be asked to walk on a treadmill and hooked up to measures monitoring your oxygen output and your heart rate. Or could also be a number of studies also use imaging tests like ECGs, echocardiograms. These are non-invasive heart imaging tests to see how your heart is functioning. And there could potentially be cardiac MRIs or nuclear PET scans too, again, especially if this is a study looking at TTR cardiomyopathy. Now, not every test is performed at every visit, but most will be done at least once during what's called a screening phase when you're seeing if you qualify for the study, and then will be repeated regularly throughout the duration of the trial, some more frequently than others. Typically, you'll have your vitals collected at every visit, but you might only, if it's a study that involves echoes, you might only do those every 6 months or so. Same with like the cardiac MRI or the PET scans. Now, it's really important to, especially if you're here on this call today to understand clinical trials, to make sure that you give some careful thought as to whether which study might be a good fit for you and whether clinical trials are something that you're really interested in. Whether or not to participate in a trial is a very personal decision, one that you should really think about carefully with your doctor and your trusted loved ones. There are a number of benefits for participating in clinical trials. There are also some risks that are important to consider. And so I'll try to outline these in general terms, but each trial is going to have a specific set of risks and benefits. And so it's important to make sure you understand those for each individual trial. First and foremost, by participating in a trial, you might get the opportunity to be treated with an investigational drug that's not available anywhere else. That is something uniquely available within clinical trials. Patients who participate in amyloidosis clinical trials receive expert and vigilant care from trained research teams that specialize in amyloidosis. In most cases, patients will be seen and monitored more frequently than they would otherwise in a real-world setting, which can be a tremendous benefit and comfort. A study center that's participating in a clinical trial for TTR amyloidosis is highly experienced and trained, which isn't necessarily going to be the case for other centers across the country that aren't participating in studies. Visiting these expert amyloidosis centers through clinical trials can offer an amazing opportunity to learn more about your disease and how to manage it, particularly if you aren't able to see experts as part of your regular care. And then last, but certainly not least, participating in research. By participating in research, some patients feel benefit from the sense that they're helping others by helping scientists better understand their disease, helping them to advance treatments, and potentially helping them discover ways to prevent it in the future. I think this is particularly true for hereditary TTR amyloidosis. So by knowing that if you're somebody who has children or who has additional generations, that you could potentially be helping to benefit those who might have inherited the genetic mutation. Now, just as there are potential benefits to participating in clinical trials, there are risks that are involved. And so making sure that you are aware of those is important. Clinical trials can involve a large investment and time commitment with the time and effort needed to travel and take part in each visit. It's not always easy to do. Some studies are more intense than others, but particularly when you're balancing other demands of life, including family and work, this is something that is important to think about. There can be risks associated with the study drug, risks that are both known as well as unknown if it's a new drug and there hasn't been as much data generated or collected on the drug to date. But there could also be risks associated with the study procedures themselves. And so it's important to understand all of the procedures that are happening and what the risks are associated with them, if there are risks associated with them. If the trial does involve an experimental or investigational drug, it might not work. And so by participating in a trial and receiving it, that investigational drug, there is a chance that you might not get any benefit from it, or benefit from over what the current standard of care is. Depending on the trial, participants could be randomly assigned to either receive that standard treatment or placebo, which is a treatment that has no active properties like a sugar pill or saline solution. So you could be assigned to either receive that or the drug, and you won't necessarily know what you've been assigned to until the end of the trial is complete. So depending on how long a trial is, you can go that entire period without knowing whether you're getting the drug or getting standard of care or placebo. And so it's really important to just understand that the potential of benefits and risks for each trial. This is something that will be explained to potential study participants at a study center through a process called informed consent. And so if this is something that you're pursuing, I really encourage you to take the time to ask questions throughout that process to the study team. Make sure that you understand the questions to the best of your ability and that you can make the best decisions for yourself. There is no right answer. It's different for every single person. So please just make sure you take the time to ask whatever questions you might have. All right, now, so for the remainder of the time, I'm going to review some of the key interventional trials that are currently happening and will be reading out and are planned for TTR amyloidosis. I'm not going to review every trial. We're in a fortunate space where there are a number of trials that are ongoing in TTR amyloidosis, but I am going to focus on trials that involve novel therapies for TTR. Now, to understand how clinical trials are approaching treatment options in TTR amyloidosis, I want to first quickly review how the disease works. This is covered in greater detail in our booklet, so if you haven't grabbed those on our website yet, or if you want some hard copies, please make sure you go ahead and get some. We'll ship those to you at no cost. I'm just going to very quickly kind of cover the basics to make sure that when we're talking about treatments, it makes sense for everybody. Now, TTR amyloidosis starts with a protein called transthyretin, or TTR. We all make and have TTR, which is a protein that is intended to transport thyroxine, the thyroid hormone, and retinol throughout the body, so transthyretin. Most of our TTR is produced in the liver, although there are small amounts that are made in the choroid plexus of the brain and in the retina. Now, in its native state, TTR is made up of 4 different subunits. If you can kind of see these little subunits right here, these 4 different subunits, and form what's called a tetramer, this 4-part protein. Now, in patients who have TTR amyloidosis, the tetramer becomes unstable, either because of a genetic mutation that the patient might have inherited, or for reasons we don't know, which is what we would call wild type TTR amyloidosis. And the 4-part tetramer dissociates into 4 subunits called monomers. These monomers, these parts of the TTR protein, then misfold and aggregate into forming amyloid fibrils, which deposit in our organ, or deposit in a patient's organs, like their heart, their peripheral nerves, the GI tract, causing organ dysfunction and damage. And so that's essentially how TTR amyloidosis works. And so now I want to think about taking that knowledge, how do you actually treat TTR amyloidosis? And so I'm going to use an analogy of comparing TTR amyloidosis to filling a bathtub. So if you think in this analogy, think of the dripping water as misfolded TTR protein that combines to form amyloid fibrils. And then the bathtub are the organs that essentially fill up with those amyloid fibrils. So either the heart or the nerves. You can see that you start with an empty bathtub, which is like your healthy organs. And over time, water fills up in that bathtub, similar to a faucet of TTR proteins, which then misfold and form amyloid fibrils, accumulating and depositing throughout the body in your organs, in your bathtub. Now, to fix or treat the full bathtub, you could either turn down or turn off the faucet, so slowing down or stopping the production of the TTR protein. When the rate of TTR production is slowed or stopped, if you're not producing it or if it's not misfolding it, then that means there isn't any protein there to misfold. The amyloid buildup will decline or halt, and your organ function will theoretically stabilize. You'd have to actually drain the tub in order to remove all of the existing protein. And so in this first part up here, all you're doing is slowing down the production of the protein or the misfolding of the protein so that it stops filling. But you'd actually have to drain the tub in order to get rid of any existing fibrils or deposits throughout the body. And so ideally, you're turning off both the faucet and draining the tub in order to prevent future production of amyloid as well as clear existing amyloid. And so it's kind of those two different approaches. You can either stop the production of TTR or the misfolded protein, turning off the faucet, or you can drain the tub. Ideally, you're doing both. And so keeping that in mind, when we look at the investigative approaches to treat TTR amyloidosis, we're going to start by looking at how do we turn off the faucet or slow it down. We're going to start by thinking about knockdown agents. So knockdown agents for TTR are designed to inhibit the production of the TTR protein in the liver, thereby reducing the levels of TTR in the body, which prevents the amyloid buildup and organ damage. And so if your body's not producing TTR, it can't go on to then dissociate into those monomers, form fibrils, and deposit in your organs. And so TTR knockdown agents, TTR knockdown agents are stopping you from forming actual fibrils. The other piece where you can essentially turn off the faucet or slow it down is by stabilizing the TTR. So where the knockdown agents are stopping your body from producing TTR, TTR stabilizers are actually binding to the TTR protein, stopping them from misfolding and then leading to amyloid fibrils. With TTR knockdown agents, you're not producing more TTR, or it's at least slowing it down. With TTR stabilizers, your body continues to produce TTR as it normally would. We're just, the drugs are designed to stop them from dissociating and then misfolding. Now, if you want to drain the tub, so these two are both turning off the faucet or slowing it down. If you actually want to drain the tub, you would need something that would be an antifibril agent. So these are typically monoclonal antibodies that have the ability to target a specific protein or harmful cell, in this case, amyloid fibrils and deposits throughout the body, and actually remove them from the affected organ. And so these are kind of the three main types of treatment approaches that are being investigated in clinical trials today for TTR amyloidosis. And so anything that is in black on this slide is a product that is approved for the treatment of TTR amyloidosis, either PN, polyneuropathy, or cardiomyopathy. And then anything that is in red is an investigational drug that is currently being studied for the treatment of TTR amyloidosis, either polyneuropathy or cardiomyopathy, wild type, or hereditary. Now you can see that some of these drugs are already approved for patients who have hereditary TTR amyloidosis with polyneuropathy and are currently being studied for patients who have cardiomyopathy. And so that's why you kind of see some of these with the red stars, like vutrisiran and eplontersen, for example. These are both approved for treatment of patients with hereditary TTR with polyneuropathy, but I've got them starred red because they're also being studied for the treatment of TTR amyloidosis with cardiomyopathy. So we've got some dual availability or differing availability for these treatments depending on what phenotype patients might have. Now, for the remainder of the time, I'm going to actually review the trials that are ongoing for amyloidosis. And I'm going to try to refer back to, again, that bathtub analogy each time. Is it something that's turning off the faucet? Is it a knockdown agent or a stabilizer? Or is it an antifibril agent that's actually draining the tub? I'm not going to, again, review every trial, but I'm going to try to focus those that involve novel therapies for TTR amyloidosis. Now, this slide is one that we're going to come back to a few times moving forward. You can see on this slide, I've listed all of the drugs, the main drugs that are being developed or are currently approved for the treatment of TTR amyloidosis and where it stands in clinical trials. So these ones that have red bars all across, these are your drugs that have been approved for TTR amyloidosis, and the ones with blue bars are ones that are currently being studied in different phases of research. We're going to start by looking at the trials that are currently recruiting, so that if you're looking enrolling in a trial today, which are the ones that are available and are actually recruiting patients, and then we'll look at trials that should be reading out soon, as well as some trials that are potentially going to be opening later in the year. And so we're going to start by looking at the trials that are currently recruiting and these ones that are outlined in red. So the acoramidis phase 3 study for TTR carriers, 2 Nex-Z studies, formerly known as NTLA-2001, one study in cardiomyopathy and one study in polyneuropathy, and then the ALXN 2220 phase 3 study for cardiomyopathy. So, and I should back up and say, I'm going to do these from top to bottom. So that's the order that I'm approaching it. So we'll start with acoramidis, then we'll go to the TTR knockdown agents, and then we'll go to the antifibril agent. So the first study is a bit of an odd one to start with because it's not actually a study for patients who have TTR amyloidosis yet, at least not yet. And so this is a study, the ACT-EARLY study is a phase 3 study of acoramidis, which is currently approved for the treatment of TTR amyloidosis patients with cardiomyopathy. It's actually going to be a study to see whether it's a phase 3 study evaluating whether treatment with acoramidis can prevent or delay the development of TTR amyloidosis in individuals who have a confirmed TTR genetic mutation like V122I, B30M, T60A, but who have not yet developed any symptoms of the disease. So this is for individuals who know they have a genetic mutation. They are most likely have a known family history of somebody who has gone on to develop the disease, but that's not always the case. But they're not currently experiencing any symptoms. And so this is going to be a study where these individuals would be offered either acoramidis or placebo and would be monitored over a period of time to see whether treatment with acoramidis can actually prevent or delay when they would develop the disease. This is going to be evaluated by measuring how long it takes gene-positive individuals to actually develop the disease, either polyneuropathy or cardiomyopathy. We would hope that treatment with acoramidis would prevent somebody from getting the disease, or at least to delay how soon they might get it. And that's what this study is designed to actually test. Participants will be monitored regularly throughout the course of the study to see if and when they develop TTR cardiomyopathy, either through a biopsy or imaging, or if they develop TTR polyneuropathy through new signs or symptoms of neuropathy and a biopsy as well. Now, the tricky thing with prevention studies like this is that we can't know when somebody who has the genetic mutation will get symptoms, or if they will even get symptoms. We know that not everybody who is gene positive actually goes on to develop this disease. And so just like we don't know who will get it, we don't know when each individual person will get it. And so there is data that suggests that most gene carriers who develop the disease will develop it around the time of the family member who passed the mutation onto them. It's not exact. And so what this study will do is recruit individuals who are within 10 years of that age or older. If a person's family history is unknown, then that time frame will be determined based off of what's been published in the literature to date. And so an example, if you are somebody who is a gene carrier, and you're in your family history, your parent or whoever passed this on to you developed the disease at the age of 50, then for you to qualify this study, you would have to be within 10 years of 50, so 40 years or older, so 40 to 75 in order to qualify for this study. If your parent developed the disease at 50 and you're 30 years old at this point, you wouldn't qualify for the study yet. And so you have to be within 10 years or older of when your family member actually developed the disease. If you don't know when your family member developed the disease, it will be based off of published literature, what that time point would be. Now, that's kind of the main entry criteria for the study. Each of the studies that I'm going to review today have dozens. Like, it's not uncommon for studies to have 40 plus different specific criteria that patients need to meet in order to qualify. I'm only planning on highlighting like some of the high level and most important criteria for each. And so for this one, I think it's that you have to know you have the genetic mutation, that you're within 10 years or older of the predicted age of disease onset based off of family history or published literature. Now, in this study, it's going to enroll 552 patients, and patients will be randomized, so assigned randomly to either receive acoramidis or placebo. And so patients will have a 50-50 chance of getting assigned to acoramidis or placebo, and it's a double-blind study, meaning that nobody, including the patient or the study doctor, is going to know until the study completes whether somebody's actually getting acoramidis or placebo. Everybody will be taking daily tablets twice a day, but we're not going to know whether it's actually the acoramidis or the placebo pill until the end of the study. And this is a long study. It's an event-driven study, meaning that the study will be complete after a certain number of participants, people who enroll, actually go on to develop TTR cardiomyopathy or polyneuropathy. And so it's an estimate, but we're guessing that it could last for up to 7 years in order for enough events to happen in order to assess whether acoramidis actually prevents or delays disease development. One thing that is important to note as part of this study, so it will provide access to an open label study after the study completes. And so an open label study is one where every participant gets access to the study drug. And so if you enroll in this study, if somebody enrolls in this study, they complete the study, either they complete it or they develop TTR cardiomyopathy during the course of the study, they're going to go on to receive acoramidis open label as part of an open label extension study. If you develop polyneuropathy, then you're going to need to go on to standard of care because acoramidis is not currently approved for the treatment of TTR polyneuropathy. But there are a number of treatments that are currently approved for polyneuropathy. If you're diagnosed with both cardiomyopathy and polyneuropathy during the course of the original study, you can still enter the open label study and receive acoramidis for your cardiomyopathy, but there needs to be a conversation with your physician about whether you need to be treated for polyneuropathy outside of the study. And so while this is a long study, it is placebo-controlled. If somebody goes on to develop the disease, there is the option to go into that open label study and receive acoramidis for cardiomyopathy and would need to be treated for polyneuropathy outside the course of the study. Now, this study is going to enroll 552 participants across the world. It's currently open in the US. There are a number of additional countries planned, including Argentina, Australia, Belgium, Brazil, Bulgaria, Canada, Denmark, France, Germany, Greece, Ireland, Italy, Malaysia, Martinique, Mexico, Netherlands, Portugal, Singapore, South Korea, Spain, Sweden, Taiwan, and UK. So this is truly a global study. It is just getting started. So it is the US for now, but additional centers will be opening. It's currently recruiting at 4 centers in the US, but there are going to be more than 30 additional centers opening over the next few months. So it's few for now, but it can sometimes take months for individual centers to open. And so I expect that as the year goes on, you'll see more and more centers opening for this study within the US. So moving on to the knockdown agents. The next study I'm going to highlight is a phase 3 study called Magnitude, which is a study of Nex-Z ziclumeran. This was a drug that many of you might have formerly heard of as NTLA 2001. It's recently been renamed Nex-Z ziclumeran, Nex-Z for short. Nex-Z is a lot easier to say, so that's what I'm going to say. This is a gene editor. And so this is a CRISPR-Cas9 gene editor. And so the way this works is that Nex-Z is something that actually stops your body from producing it removes the genetic code that would be needed to actually go on to create the TTR protein. And so this is going to stop your body from actually producing TTR so that it can then no longer go on to misfold and form amyloid fibrils that deposit. And so this is a large phase 3 study looking at the safety and efficacy of Nex-Z in patients with TTR cardiomyopathy, both wild type and hereditary. And so it's measuring efficacy, but what is efficacy? Efficacy is the ability of a drug to produce a desired effect in expert hands and under ideal circumstances. It's typically a measurement of whether a patient feels better, functions better, or lives longer. And so this study is going to evaluate whether Nex-Z works by assessing whether treatment with Nex-Z reduces the risk of cardiovascular-related events, so death, urgent heart failure visits, and cardiovascular hospitalizations. Now, in order to qualify for this study, patients need to have a medical history of heart failure and an NT-proBNP, which is a cardiac blood measure, greater than 1,000. Patients can't have had any treatment with TTR silencers over the past 12 months, and they can't have any prior experience with vutrisiran or Amvuttra. And importantly, if you're enrolling in this study, you have to agree not to take vutrisiran or Amvuttra during the course of the study. And so this is something that's important to think about, particularly if you're a patient who has hereditary TTR with polyneuropathy, or if you have TTR cardiomyopathy. We'll talk about Amvuttra in a little bit, but there is the possibility that it will be approved for treatment of TTR cardiomyopathy in the next few months. And so this is going to be something that you really need to think about in terms of whether you want to go on a trial and if you're willing to forego treatment with a currently available therapy. If you're taking tafamidis, you can continue taking tafamidis or acoramidis. You just need to be on stable doses prior to enrolling. The way this study works is that patients will be randomized to receive either Nex-Z through a one-time IV infusion, which is an injection to the vein, or to placebo. And so study participants will have a 2 out of 3 chance of receiving Nex-Z, so 67%, or a 1 out of 3 chance to receive placebo. And again, you're not going to know until the end of the study whether you actually got the active treatment or the placebo. This is another event-driven study, and so it means that the study will complete after a certain number of cardiovascular events have occurred over the whole population of study patients. And so that means it's impossible to predict exactly how long it will take the study to complete. Every patient is going to be studied for at least 18 months, but participation could last for up to 4 years in order for enough events to assess efficacy. So again, it's going to be something that you have to think about, particularly if you're somebody who's interested in taking a gene silencer. You have to be willing to not take those treatments while you're enrolled in this study, which could be 4 years. And so something to think about. The advantage of potentially enrolling in this study is it's the one-time infusion, whereas with gene silencers, you are going to need to take those repeatedly throughout the course of your life. And so it's a very careful discussion with your physician, with your family, about what works best for you and what makes the most sense for you. Now, this study is going to enroll 765 patients across the world. It's currently open in 17 countries and recruiting at 27 centers here in the US. And again, this is a study where I expect there may be additional centers open, but I'm excited to see that there are a number of centers open globally as well as within the US for participation. Now, that study focused on cardiomyopathy. There's another study, a smaller study, that is looking at Nex-Z in patients who have hereditary TTR amyloidosis with polyneuropathy, specifically hereditary. So this is a smaller study. It's going to assess whether patients who are treated with Nex-Z perform better on clinical measurements of peripheral neuropathy tests, so a series of short tests of motor and sensory impairment. In order to qualify for this study, patients need to have a confirmed diagnosis of hereditary TTR amyloidosis with polyneuropathy, without advanced heart failure, and no prior experience with gene silencers. And so for this reason, this study is it's likely only going to be conducted in regions that have limited or no access to gene silencers currently. And so this will not be a study that will be opening within the United States, for example, given that we've got access to a number of gene silencers. For those who do participate in this study, though, there's a 50% chance of being assigned and receiving placebo during the course of the 18-month study, but there is the opportunity for patients to cross over to active treatment at about 12 or 18 months, depending on different criteria that need to be met. And so, as I mentioned, this won't be a study that opens in the US. It's currently open in Australia and New Zealand, but there will be additional countries opening, but likely countries that don't currently have widespread access to gene silencers for patients who have hereditary TTR amyloidosis with polyneuropathy. Okay, moving on. The last recruiting slide that I'm going to cover for the treatment of TTR amyloidosis is the depleter cardiomyopathy study. So the DepleTTR-CM study, which is a large phase 3 study evaluating the safety and efficacy of ALXN2220, which is an amyloid fibril depleter, so one that drains the tub, targeting the active removal of pre-existing amyloids and restoring heart function and elasticity in adult patients with TTR cardiomyopathy, both wild type and hereditary or variant TTR. This study is going to evaluate whether ALXN2220 works by assessing whether treatment with it during the course of the study reduces the risk of all-cause mortality, of death, and cardiovascular clinical events. And so this study is focusing on patients who have more advanced cardiomyopathy. So you'll notice a higher NT-proBNP criteria. You've got to have NT-proBNP of at least 2,000, whereas in the magnitude study that I highlighted earlier, that was at the 1,000 range. Patients will be able to enroll in this study even if they are currently receiving local standard therapy, but they can't have any prior treatment with other amyloid depleters in order to qualify. And so if you've been in another study where you received an amyloid depleter, you will not qualify for this study. ALXN2220 is administered as an IV infusion every 28 days or every 4 weeks. And just like the other studies, this is a study where patients are going to be randomized to either receive the study drug ALXN2220 or placebo. And so there's a 2 out of 3 or 67% chance of receiving the study drug, a 1 out of 3 or 33% chance of receiving placebo. This is also double blind, meaning that nobody is going to know, either you or the study doctor, which treatment you are actually receiving until the end of the study. And similar to the magnitude study, this is a event-driven study, meaning that it's going to continue until the last patient enrolled had 2 years of treatment, so this is not an event-driven study similar to the last one. It's going to continue until the last patient enrolled has had 2 years of treatment, and it's anticipated that each patient will likely participate in the study for about 2 to 4 years. And I've got the study website noted there on the bottom. The study is going to enroll 1,000 patients across the world. It's currently open in 27 different countries across most continents. There are 41, so there are currently 35 centers open in the US with, I think, 6 additional centers planned in the coming months. And so this is a study that's currently open in a number of centers for recruitment within the US. Okay, so that was the studies that are currently recruiting. If you're interested in enrolling in a trial for a novel therapy in TTR amyloidosis, those are kind of the 4 biggest options. With that said, there are a number of studies that are ongoing today that are going to have results reading out over the next few months to years that are important to keep an eye on, because this could help inform future decisions, either regarding treatment or next steps in terms of studies. And so I'm going to kind of outline these quickly. The vutrisiran cardiomyopathy study, the HELIOS-B study, eplontersen for cardiomyopathy, Coramitug for cardiomyopathy, and then ATTR-2 for patients with cardiac amyloidosis. So vutrisiran is a gene silencer, a TTR knockdown agent that is administered as quarterly subcutaneous injections and is currently approved and available for the treatment of patients who have hereditary TTR polyneuropathy. It's also been studied over the past few years in a study called HELIOS-B, a large phase 3 study. This study read out earlier in 2024, showing that treatment with vutrisiran reduced the combined risk of death and cardiovascular complications in patients with TTR cardiomyopathy, while also helping to maintain physical function and quality of life. The data has been submitted to the FDA for review, and the FDA is required to make a decision as to whether to approve this drug by March 23rd of this year. So in almost just a little bit over 2 months, we'll know whether this drug is approved for the treatment of TTR cardiomyopathy patients, both hereditary and wild type. And so if this gets approved, it will be the first gene silencer, the first TTR knockdown agent that will be approved for the treatment of TTR cardiomyopathy. So definitely something to keep an eye on. We will share this news as it becomes available to us with patients who follow us through social media and on our newsletter. Another large phase 3 study that's ongoing right now is the CARDIO-TTRansform study. So this is a study of eplontersen, which is another gene silencer, a TTR knockdown agent, one that's slowing down or turning off the faucet. Eplontersen is a subcutaneous injection every 4 weeks and is currently, like vutrisiran, currently approved for the treatment of TTR polyneuropathy in hereditary TTR patients. This CARDIO-TTRansform study is the largest phase 3 study to date. It's in more than 1,400 patients over 2.5 years long. This is like starting to rival the size of studies that take place in Alzheimer's, which is just remarkable given that it's still technically a rare disease. It's assessing whether treatment with eplontersen improves outcomes of cardiovascular mortality and recurrent cardiovascular events compared to placebo. And so this is a very large study. It's currently ongoing. Its recruitment is closed, so it's not available to recruit in now, but it's something to keep an eye on because the results from this study are expected to be shared in 2026. And so something to keep an eye on. Again, we'll share results as they become made available. Coramitug which many of you might have seen historically as NNC 6019-0001. This is an antifibril therapy. And so this is the first therapy we're looking at today, or no, I'm sorry, it's the second therapy we're looking at today that is actually draining the tub, an antifibril therapy. And so it's designed to prevent new TTR amyloid fibril formation and clear previously deposited TTR amyloid present in the affected organs through stimulation of antibody-dependent phagocytosis. So this is draining the tub. This is getting rid of the amyloid. It's designed to get rid of the amyloid that's been accumulating in hearts. It's currently being studied in patients with TTR cardiomyopathy in a phase 2 study. We expect the results from that study to read out this year in 2025 and are hoping to see if the results are positive that this would move into additional studies for patients with TTR cardiomyopathy. But as those results become available, again, we'll share those with patients and keep you informed as if and when new studies are opening for this antifibril therapy. And then the last study to keep an eye on that's currently ongoing is of AT02. And so this is another monoclonal antibody, whereas Alexion 2220 and Coramitug are designed to specifically target the TTR fibrils that are accumulating in organs. AT02 is different in that it's designed to bind and treat to all types of systemic amyloidosis fibrils by stimulating the immune system to remove amyloid deposits. So it's designed to attach to TTR amyloid, to TTR fibrils, AL fibrils, ALEC2 fibrils, the rarer types of amyloidosis fibrils. This is currently in a 3-part phase 1 study. The results from the study are expected in 2025 this year, and we're hoping to see that if positive, this moves into additional studies in the future. And so the last slide that I want to show in terms of specific investigative treatment trials is this slide about what future trials we know are currently planned in the TTR space. And so this one right here is where I want to focus on. Alnylam, who's the drug developer for patisiran and vutrisiran, has recently announced that they are going to share plans for a phase 3 study of nucresiran in patients with TTR cardiomyopathy. Nucresiran is a gene silencer similar to patisiran and vutrisiran. So it works by knocking down, it's a TTR knockdown agent. It's going to slow down or turn off that faucet so that your body's not producing more TTR protein, so it can't go on to misfold and form fibrils. But nucresiran is different from patisiran and vutrisiran in that it's a subcutaneous injection that potentially only needs to be dosed once or twice a year. And so where vutrisiran is quarterly subcutaneous injections, this might be just once or twice a year. And so it's kind of a follow-on therapy to vutrisiran. And so this is going to be moving into phase 3 for TTR cardiomyopathy. It's been studied in healthy volunteers up until now, but we should know later, like within the next month or so, about what the phase 3 study design for TTR cardiomyopathy will look like. And so if you're interested in potentially enrolling in a study later this year, if this is something that you're interested in, please just follow ARC. We'll keep you informed as this study opens and we understand more about what it's going to look like. Now, that was a lot to go through in a really short amount of time, and it also only presents a portion of the trials that are currently recruiting in the TTR space. There are a number of different observational trials that are ongoing. I've listed on this slide. I focused on multi-center studies. There are a number of single-center trials that are going on at amyloidosis centers across the country. I've included links on these slides. If you're interested in learning about more about these, we won't have time to go through them. I did want to quickly highlight some of the imaging studies that have recently started and could be of interest to this patient, to patients with TTR amyloidosis, or to individuals who think they might have TTR amyloidosis. And so I'm going to just quickly cover these two imaging trials, the REVEAL trials and the CARDIAG trial. The REVEAL study, this is a study of, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Evuzamitide, which is a diagnostic radiotracer that is being studied to diagnose cardiac amyloidosis of different types. So it's being used to determine whether it can, the sensitivity and specificity of Evuzamitide to detect cardiac amyloidosis, whether that's AL amyloidosis, TTR amyloidosis, APOA4, ALEC2. It just needs to be somebody who has suspected amyloidosis with cardiac involvement. And so it includes patients or individuals who might have had a positive amyloid biopsy from either carpal tunnel surgery or from a spinal laminectomy, if you're somebody who was found to have amyloid as part of your spinal stenosis surgery, as long as no other organs have been identified. So if you've had a carpal tunnel, found amyloid on the biopsy, but you don't have heart involvement yet, you don't have nerve involvement, this could potentially be a study where you are given this radio tracer and it's used to determine whether it can actually help diagnose you with TTR amyloidosis or AL amyloidosis, some type of amyloidosis. And so if you're a patient who has suspected cardiomyloidosis, no other organs have been identified, and as long as you haven't been previously diagnosed definitively with a type of systemic amyloidosis and you have relatively okay kidney function, you would qualify for this study. So it's going to look for up to 200 patients. It's a single one-time infusion. It's about patient participation will last for about 60 days. It requires 3 in-person visits, and everybody will receive Evuzamitide as part of this study. And so this study just started, I think it was last week, was the first patient that was enrolled. Brigham and Women's, so Dr. Sharmila Dabala in Boston at Brigham and Women's is currently the only center that's recruiting, but there are about 20 centers that are planned to participate in this study over the next few months. And so if you're somebody that's been struggling with the diagnosis, this could potentially be a good option to consider. Likewise, the CARDIAG study, which is a study of Florbetaben, which is a radiopharmaceutical that's indicated, it's currently approved for diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease by attaching to actually the A beta plaques that are associated with Alzheimer's disease. This study is evaluating whether it can also be used to diagnose cardiac amyloidosis, so similar to the REVEAL study. And so this study, it's a little funny because it's actually the main focus is on like the primary endpoint is focused on the diagnosis of cardiac AL amyloidosis, but it actually has some secondary goals or additional goals to differentiate between AL and TTR amyloidosis. And so again, like the previous study, it's looking for patients who are being considered for a possible diagnosis of cardiac amyloidosis, regardless of subtype, and it's being used to see whether it can actually tell the difference between AL amyloidosis and TTR amyloidosis. So all that to say, if you're somebody with suspected TTR amyloidosis, haven't received a formal diagnosis yet, this is a study that you might consider as being of interest. Like Evuzamitide, this is a single IV infusion. Everybody will receive Florbetaben as part of this, and it's about 12 weeks to be involved in the actual study. It's like this previous study, enrolling 200 patients across the world at 14 different centers. There are 2 centers in the US currently, Philadelphia and Kansas City, Missouri, with an additional center planning to open in the Pittsburgh area. This was like a lot. How to find trials and stay informed. There are a few different ways. First and foremost, there's clinicaltrials.gov. So all of the information that I presented to you today was taken from and available on clinicaltrials.gov. With that said, it is not the easiest website to use. I struggle to find trials that I know about on that website sometimes. And so I also highly suggest you talk to your healthcare provider, make sure you are in frequent communication with them, that you're asking them about trials, making it clear to them that if this is something that you're interested in. Make sure you follow patient organizations like ARC, amyloidosis support groups. If you're outside of the US, country-specific groups, they're a great way to stay informed. And last, but certainly not least, I would sign up for my Amyloidosis Pathfinder. This is a tool that ARC developed to keep you informed of clinical trials as well as treatment centers based off of your type of amyloidosis. And so it's a free to use tool. You can go to myamyloidosispathfinder.org, fill out a very brief survey that asks you what type of amyloidosis you have, what organs you might have involved, if you have experience with different treatments, and it will keep you informed as new trials are recruiting that you might be eligible for. So you'll get an email each time a new trial opens that you might be interested in completing. And so it's a great way to stay informed of and get involved with clinical trials and ultimately help advance research towards better treatments and a cure for amyloidosis. I'm sorry this was so long. We did this once like 6 months ago, and there were not as many trials enrolling at that time. And so I'm thrilled that I have more to talk about today, but it makes for a longer presentation. And yeah.
So Kristen, thank you. And I take a breath. It's amazing and so exciting that there is so much going on. I would suggest typically we run these from 12 to 1. I would love to just say that we'll extend this for another 10 minutes. We've got some large number of questions and we won't for sure be able to get through all of them, but there are a few themes that have really are throughout the questions. And I'd love to just touch at least on those. And one of those is it would be helpful to understand a bit about the difference between neuropathy with hereditary ATTR and wild type. A lot of patients with wild type say they are experiencing neuropathy, and would the treatments help them? Can they participate in clinical trials? And if not, why not?
Yeah, so it's an interesting and unfortunate problem that we find ourselves in today. Historically, everybody thought that if you had wild type TTR amyloidosis, it was entirely a cardiac disease. Heart was the only organ that was involved. Some of the older studies that were done in wild type TTR amyloidosis didn't collect any data asking patients if they were having symptoms of neuropathy. And so we're only starting to now understand how neuropathy impacts patients with wild type TTR amyloidosis, how and if. And so unfortunately, the research and the availability of these treatments to patients with neuropathy hasn't caught up with what we're starting to see now, which is that patients with wild type, it is a multisystemic disease, and it's not just always the heart that's involved. And so if you have neuropathy with wild type TTR amyloidosis, I would encourage you to get involved in any observational trials that you can. So if there are registries available, anything that is going to collect data that helps us understand how neuropathy is impacting you and what it looks like over the time. We developed actually a patient-reported outcome tool called the TTR amyloid, the ATTR-QOL, the transthyretin amyloidosis quality of life questionnaire, a questionnaire that really helps to actually capture all of the different symptoms that patients are experiencing and how they're impacting their lives. And so it's really important to generate this data to be able to bring to drug developers to show them that there is a need to develop these drugs for polyneuropathy patients who have wild type TTR amyloidosis. And so it's an unfortunate place to be in, and I'm hopeful that we'll get there, but we need to start by generating the data that shows that this is something that is common in wild type patients, and there is a need to develop these drugs for polyneuropathy with wild type TTR amyloidosis.
And somebody actually also commented was asking about other symptoms such as GI issues, those being measured. And again, that speaks to the need for hearing from patients what matters to them and their symptoms that they experience and capturing those. So that's why this quality of life measure is so important. So another question that we have is from somebody who wanted with hereditary ATTR. When you talk about age of onset being, within this 10-year range, is that from the first symptoms that a parent or grandparent might have experienced, or from when they were diagnosed?
Actually, a really good question. I don't know, and I don't want to say the wrong thing. My sense is that it's probably from when the first symptoms occurred versus an actual diagnosis, but that's certainly something that we can follow up with the study sponsor and make sure that we get right. And so I know it's hard where many patients are experiencing symptoms for years before they get an actual diagnosis. And so I want to make sure I get that right. And that's definitely something that we can follow up on, but it's a great question.
Excellent. And this sort of goes back to the first question of, if you have wild type and polyneuropathy, can you participate in any of the studies? Or are those just for the hereditary patients?
So if it's a study so unfortunately right now, there are only studies recruiting for, you have cardiomyopathy, you would qualify, but if you're only experiencing polyneuropathy because you've got carpal tunnel or spinal stenosis, you most likely will not qualify for the trials that are currently recruiting. It's something to discuss with your doctor, but they're looking for heart involvement as the key entry criteria. And
another question which we've heard, I've seen throughout again all the questions, is the frustration at why do you have to have significant symptoms? We're hearing about people getting diagnosed very early. And this can be from, why does my NT-proBNP have to be so high, to I have been diagnosed with wild type, but I don't yet have cardiac involvement. Why aren't there trials for me?
Yeah. So when anybody is designing a clinical trial, to show that a drug works, you need to be able to make some assumptions as to what would happen to a patient and how long it would take the disease to progress if they were to get no treatment. And so oftentimes when you're designing a trial today, you're relying on data that was collected 5 to 10 years ago that tells you what normal disease progression looked like. TTR amyloidosis is a really cool space in that we have done such an amazing job over the last 5 years of diagnosing patients earlier in the course of their disease. But what it means is we're diagnosing them in this time period where we don't know how quickly they're going to progress. And so the trials that are being designed today are being designed in patient populations where we have a good idea of how long it will take them to progress so that we can actually show an effect of whether that drug is working or not. And so it is an unfortunate space to be in. Unfortunately, the data hasn't caught up to where we are in a real world practice. I do think we're going to start seeing more trials in the future that are looking at earlier disease populations. So patients who are diagnosed earlier in their course of the disease. But unfortunately, it's going to take some time to generate enough data for study sponsors to be able to confidently design those trials in a way where there's a reasonable chance of success. I think we'll get there, but unfortunately today, we just need more data, and we need to have a better understanding of what that early disease progression means, which speaks to the need to take part in observational studies, registries, participating in survey studies. All of that data is used to ultimately design those earlier treatment studies of therapeutic products. I think we'll get there. It's just, it takes some time, and we haven't caught up with what the real world practice is.
And it's certainly something that is recognized by the community. We have programs like the Amyloidosis Forum that you lead, working with FDA and the amyloid scientific community and pharmaceutical companies that are really partnering together to look at this next area of research. So it is something to to keep following us and keep thinking about, and we are definitely thinking of moving it forwards. And again, this is sort of in line with that. In the ACT early study, why do they not include ATTR wild type?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it gets back to being able to reasonably predict who's going to get the disease. In order to show that a treatment is preventing disease, preventing development of a disease or onset of a disease, you have to have reasonable confidence that most of the participants that you enroll in the study would, if untreated, go on to develop it. And we ultimately don't know why patients get wild type TTR amyloidosis. We don't know who will get it, and we don't know why. And so that's why would be really challenging to design a study showing that you could prevent onset of wild type TTR amyloidosis when we don't know who would actually get it. And so starting with patients who have a known genetic mutation and have a family history gives you reasonable confidence that they're likely to go on to develop the disease, and you would be able to show an impact of treatment.
Excellent. And interestingly, this is something Chris and I were talking about just before the call, and somebody's asked the question, so I will ask it, because I went, no, this is complicated, but somebody's asked it. So are carpal tunnel and spinal stenosis caused by infiltration of the nerve by amyloid fibrils or deposition surrounding the nerve pressing upon it?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's the latter. And that's why you see carpal tunnel and spinal stenosis indicated as signs and red flags of TTR amyloidosis, but not necessarily as symptoms. And so they are caused by amyloid depositing around the nerves, putting pressure on your nerves. And so in carpal tunnel, it's depositing in the tenuis synovium, and it's putting pressure on your actual nerve. Whereas patients who have hereditary TTR polyneuropathy actually have amyloid deposits in their peripheral nerves, and that's what's causing the dysfunction. So it is slightly different. The studies that are being done today in patients who have hereditary TTR amyloidosis with polyneuropathy are studying patients who have amyloid deposition in the nerves and the dysfunction that's caused by that, not necessarily amyloid around and putting pressure on the nerves. Press somebody else.
That was great to have that question answered. And then we have a couple of questions around how do I enroll in a clinical trial? And also a few questions from, are these trials available in Canada?
Yes, so I didn't list all of the study centers. So I'm going to start with the second part. I didn't list all of the study centers in Canada, but a number of these studies are recruiting in Canada. And so if you go to My Amyloidosis Pathfinder, we list all of the study centers that are recruiting in the US and Canada. Likewise, you can also go to clinicaltrials.gov. Some of these studies have study websites where they list every center. And so where a study has a website, I included those on the slides as well. And so I focused on the US today in terms of the US map, but that's not to say that there aren't also happening at centers in Canada. The first question about how to participate in it, if you're interested in participating in a clinical trial, what to do. So first and foremost, I would talk to your study doctor. Let them know that you are interested in clinical trials. Ask them if they're connected with any, if they have connections to help you. In My Amyloidosis Pathfinder, we list the contacts for each specific trial at a center. So you can reach out to centers directly and let them know you are interested in participating, asking them what the next steps are. Likewise, clinicaltrials.gov also will usually list an email address or a phone number, or have a central email address where you can email and say, hey, I want to participate. How do I do it? But I think it's those two-part approaches, talking to your study doctor, and then you do need to be, you need to be direct and really, some of these trials end up recruiting very quickly because there are so many patients with TTR amyloidosis. And so you do need to act and be a bit direct in terms of reaching out to centers and letting them know, I'm interested. What information do you need? How do I set up an appointment? Can we set up a pre-screening call sort of thing? So. But staying informed through MAP is really, I would say, a good option. And we'll list those contacts for you to do it.
And always feel free to contact us if you're having any challenges. We're always happy to help and guide you on steps you might take. And lastly, because we are really at well over time, but there were just a few questions around criteria that if you've had a heart transplant, would that stop you being in a trial? Do you have to come off if you're on another treatment? Do you have to come off the treatment? And is age a limiting factor?
Yeah, so most studies will have inclusion-exclusion criteria around heart transplant. And so there are specific studies for patients who have had a heart transplant, but most of the trials that I recruited for today, you would be ineligible if you've previously had a heart transplant. Again, I didn't cover every trial. There are specifically trials for individuals who've had solid organ transplant. The age piece, there are typically age criteria. So most studies, one, you have to be an adult, so over the age of 18. And then most studies will limit the upper age of recruitment to like 85 or 90. It varies by study, but again, it is because being in a study is an intense process. You've got to go through a lot, and there needs to be, it can be really detrimental to a study if somebody enrolls and then can't actually complete the visits, the procedures, has trouble being compliant with the study schedule. And compliance is a hard word to use, but that's ultimately what it is. It can really actually hurt the overall study and patient population. And so there are limitations put on the upper age of enrollment for a number of reasons, partly the compliance. There's also, as patients old, they get other types of comorbidities, which can make the data really hard to interpret for a given patient population. And so there are usually upper age criteria. 85 or 90 tends to be, depending on the study, the upper limit. And I feel like there was a third one you asked, and I can't remember what it was.
No, the treatment, heart transplant treatments and age.
Okay.
Well, thank you. We are over time, and I can hear you getting a little hoarse from speaking to it so much. This was really excellent. It's so helpful, I know, even though we talk about this every day, just to run through them and hear all the options. I urge anybody to, and we will send a link afterwards, to sign up for My Amyloidosis Pathfinder at myamyloidosispathfinder.org. That will really keep you informed of any trials that are coming up. And also, don't hesitate to reach out. support@archi.org is probably the easiest way to reach us, and we will email and call you back. We have a phenomenal support team in the background that are here to help support and guide you. So thank you, Kristen. We will be sharing this talk afterwards. We'll have it both on our website, and we'll send a link so that you can find it. Yes, thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Stay warm.
Yeah.